All right, welcome everyone to week 2 of our uh, study of the Epistle of James. Um, this week we are focusing on chapter 1 verse 19 through chapter 2 verse 13. So it's because of it being 5 chapters for the whole epistle and 6 weeks of this study, we're splitting it up a little bit, and then we'll eventually end up on a chapter a week after next week. We will not read that whole chunk in one go. I learned my lesson from last week that we had a bit more to chew on all at once than I think was helpful. So we'll split it into 2 halves. So I will go ahead and I will share the screen here. Macs always give me a hard time. I'm very much a PC person. Give me 1 second to get these verses up for anyone who needs them on the screen. All right. Sharing now. Okay. So I think it probably makes sense to start with our first chunk will be the end of chapter 1. I think there's a few things that I'll bring up, but I'll bring them up after we do a little bit of reading. Just in general, this first section that we'll read is it's wisdom literature, so it's generally practical advice for how to live your life is kind of what we're getting in really this whole section that we're reading today. And so the first section is 2 warnings in general: a warning against the dangers of anger and against the failure to practice what you hear. And so that's what we'll get in this this first half of our reading day. So verse 19 through 27 in chapter 1. Would anyone be willing to read this portion? Can either be from what I've got on the screen or from your own translation of the Bible if you have one open.
I'll give it a shot if you want.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. This is through NIV. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and, after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world.
Thank you, Tom.
Sure thing.
So I'll open it up. Is there anything that jumps out, is interesting, um, or stirs up any feelings for anyone in these first this first part of the passage?
As a preface, if I could, I'd just like to address something in verse 18, because I just kind of superficially said real quick about, talked about that, the birth of the word of birth by the word of truth, so that we will become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And I was speculating that perhaps the word of truth was referring to Jesus, and I did some more looking into that, and I think that's true indirectly. I think the word of truth probably is more specifically referring to the Old Testament, more specifically the gospel about Jesus, what was true about him, and that the fact that his death and his resurrection made it possible for us to become first fruits of his creatures. Of course, first fruits refers to a festival that was the Sunday usually in Passover, and they celebrated it in the same way kind of that we celebrate Thanksgiving, but they celebrate it early in the year when the barley crop comes in, and it's right when they're getting the first parts of that, and they celebrate that as thanking God, and the fact that because of the gospel, the fact that Jesus came, died, rose again, it enables us to be the harvest, the first of the harvest of his creatures. So I just I took kind of a superficial swipe, and I'd like to be a little more precise in that, because I didn't think I gave a very good explanation for that. But anyway, so
Well, yeah, thank you for doing a little deeper dive on that. And yeah, James is not alone in describing the early Christians as the first fruits. That's a phrase that Paul uses frequently in some of the other epistles. So I think you're right on with the what you found out about it.
My Bible, when its translation is, "We are of all creation his prized possession."
Hmm.
Not, he doesn't use the word first fruits. He does have that in a notification translation note on the side here, but
Interesting.
but it was prized possession. I kind of like that. It makes you feel like you're special. Human beings were special.
Yeah.
well,
It's interesting because it takes away the I don't. It might be a good thing that it takes away the place of privilege for the early adopters.
Mhm.
I'm
sorry, Tom. Were you about to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say regarding to what I just read, that we every time we meet, we pray for peace in the world, which is a great thing. But to me, verse 19 and 20, that's the blueprint for getting in life and with wars and everything, where it says everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. If we could all do that, that's it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
It just really struck home with me.
I That does raise an interesting question, though, and I don't have an answer to this. This is just posing a question. Is human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires? Does that mean there is no place for righteous anger that moves people to action?
Ooh.
That's a difficult question, of course, but I don't think this is addressing that specifically, but I do find in my own life, have a difficult time sometimes distinguishing between righteous anger and my anger. And I think when I think of my own anger, when I answer in my own anger, it doesn't always produce God's righteousness. Sometimes it just is not well thought through, and it's just venting.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we can take it this passage as an absolute condemnation of all types of anger or its expression, but as the fact that you better be careful. If you're angry about something and you're expressing out of that, you better take an extra beat or two before you say something, because yeah, at least that's true with me. I don't always have fully formed thoughts or very well thought through things. It takes me a while to process things anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, there's a sort of a Chinese proverb that I try to hold, which is delay is the antidote to anger. If you stop and ponder and think and evaluate, maybe there's another way, a calmer reaction.
sometimes we're caught up in our initial response and we want to say it right away because we don't want the moment to pass.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's better to let the moment pass. And then if and when the opportunity comes to speak, you can do it later, because seizing the day when you're angry sometimes doesn't always have the best results, at least not for me.
I think
if you look into, is any anger actually righteous? Instead of being angry, can we try to find a solution for something? And
Well,
I mean, I know it's human nature, we get angry, but is it any of it righteous?
that's a good question. I think Jesus was kind of angry when he cleared the temple. I think he
that's
was
true.
angry when he spoke to the Pharisees and several times, and he called them snakes, whitewashed tombs, and stuff like that. Of course, he's Jesus, and I'm not. So I got to be careful with my because, but Jesus sometimes expressed his anger. I think there is a case for sometimes when things are so wrong, so unjust, and we're talking. Brian was talking about some of those things today. The way that trans people are being treated, the way that people of color are being treated, immigrants are being treated. We need to speak. We need to speak strongly, and we need to feel passion about that. But we need to consider our words and do it in an appropriate way, because unlike Jesus, I can't make those split decisions. I've got to be careful what I say and what I do. If I were at the temple and I were that mad, I'd probably be beating on people, and stuff like that. But I don't think that's what Jesus did. But that's a good question, Tom. I think it is. Can we have righteous anger? And if we do, how careful do we have to be that it's righteous anger?
Right. And I think we can certainly say that we should be passionate about our beliefs, whether we feel comfortable with the term angry or not. There should be strong emotion behind it if we believe what we say we believe, and we believe in well-being for all people. That when we see that people are being mistreated, then it should upset us.
Yeah, I like the way my Bible, it says human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. But I read a book, I don't remember the book it was, and it recommended me to change all the words that says righteousness on there or righteous to justice. And when you change it, it kind of makes it says human anger does not produce the justice God desires. And I thought, well, that makes sense, because what it is we need, rather than just speaking and being angry, we need to go out and do what David was mentioning or whatever, get the justice out there somehow, whatever it is, to help fix the problem, to help encourage the people that are being anyway, we just need to speak justice, and I like that word better than righteousness, because righteousness almost seems different than justice, because justice means you need to go out there and do something to make the justice there where God wants it to be, rather than not there.
The Greek for righteousness is dikaiosune. That's the word. And in its root meanings, it doesn't mean justice as we like to think of it, where there's a judge and he judges you wrong. It's not judgment. Righteousness is bringing the right things about in all cases. It more implies, for our understanding, it more implies justice. And that's why it is a good translation of the dikaiosune, because it's the divine justice, not justice in terms of legal terms, but divine justice in making all things just in all places for all people. And so, yeah, so that's a good point, Leslie. Yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to bring up from that I found interesting in a commentary I was reading as I was preparing for this Bible study is the idea that mirrors were not well made at this time, in the same way that they are now. And so it was kind of well known and understood in the cultural context that a mirror image was not an exact copy. It was a distorted image of what was real. And the Greek also looks at his face. The literal translation of that is the face of his birth. And so there's a contrast that I think we're missing from the translation and the cultural context between the face of your birth and the face you see in the mirror. There's a distance between them, which I thought was interesting and would not have known just from reading this. And I wanted to share that all with you.
That's good. And Paul refers to that. He refers to it as looking into a glass darkly, because the mirrors back then weren't nice shiny glass on a backing of something that made it reflect. No, they were like generally polished pieces of metal and things like that. And so the surface wasn't smooth, it wasn't rounded and reflect, and it didn't really necessarily reflect reality. And I was going to point that out too, that Paul used this symbolism as well. So yeah. I was looking at verse 21, and it talks about the implanted word. So I'm thinking about, what does that mean? And I think it means something similar to the parable of the sower that we find in Luke. It's not just to know, but the words from the Old Testament, the words that Jesus spoke, the gospel, those things. But it's not just enough to hear those words, but those words have to actually be implanted into us and become part of our being, just like in the parable of the sower. So I thought that was an interesting portion here.
This is the downside to having split up the first half and the second half of this chapter, is we in verse 15, we talk about desire being conceived and then giving birth to sin. And so we have a negative birth imagery as opposed to a planting a good. It's a contrasting image to what was given before. So instead of having the sin desire and sin planted in you, you're having the word planted in you for a better outcome.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
The author of this was this is why we don't think this was actually James, the brother of Jesus, is because rhetorically the structure of this is very impressive, and we don't believe that the brother of the carpenter brother was right who spoke Aramaic was writing this well in this classical style in Greek. This is someone who knew how to write a strong argument.
It almost seems like how Paul wrote a little bit, where he was always doing arguments about different things in his epistles.
Mm-hmm. You'll see even more of that a little bit later. Paul loves to use diatribes where he is kind of arguing against himself, against an imaginary opponent. And then
Yes.
we'll get a little bit of that later in James too. And it'll feel familiar to the way that Paul often writes.
It's interesting to me that James, who is sometimes looked at as a Jerusalem Christian who is still trying to maintain the law, in a sense, as being that maybe early Christians should still keep the law, the Old Testament law. I'm not sure how true it is, but the thing I noticed in verse 25, he talks about those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and to the Jew, and the idea is that the law was not binding, the law was liberating. The fact that having this guidance from God didn't make our lives more,
Mm-hmm.
controlled, but it gave us liberty to live the kind of life that we really want to live, to persevere, And so I haven't looked at that in depth, and I was doing some commentary work, and they didn't say a whole lot of that about that, but I was just noticing that it's interesting that calls the law of liberty. And that's not quite like Paul would necessarily refer to it. He refers to law more as a taskmaster or a teacher that shows us that we can't keep the law, and so we move on to grace.
There are many people who believe that this epistle was written at least partially in response to some of the teachings of Paul, because prior to Paul, it would have been inconceivable to Jewish people that it would be a difference between faith and works. They're bound together, and this idea of you can have faith without acting upon it is something that really started to come about with some of Paul's teachings.
Or at least, people
like Paul.
More generous people who followed Paul, and as is common when they took Paul's thoughts and pushed them to an extreme where they no longer were what Paul was trying to get at, that Paul could be pushed into antinomianism, which means anti-law. Nomianism is law, so that you didn't have to really worry about behaving in any particular way. It's just enough to have faith and kind of abstract knowledge or belief. Yeah.
That is a fair point. Yeah. I love Paul, so I try not to demonize him, but it is certainly the way people understood his teachings, probably more so than what they actually were.
I criticize Paul, but I only criticize him in the sense that he was a man of his time, just as James was. And they had certain understandings that came out of their Judaism and out of the way people believed things at the time. The science, the understanding of the way the world works was different than it is now. And they were people of their time. They were trying to do the best they could, but they just didn't have the understanding. And sometimes, like all of us, we miss it a little bit. And sometimes the things we say are taken more extremely or in different ways than we actually meant them. And I think that's some of what's going on here.
Any other thoughts on this first half of what we were going to read today, or would we like to move on to the beginning of chapter 2?
Why don't we look at 27 real quick?
Okay.
I just think that's a key to what's going on here with James. And it does contrast a little bit with some of the others. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Now, for James, it seems to be that keeping oneself unstained by the world means largely not being contaminated by the values of this world, where rich people and having lots of money was given was preferred. Those people were put on a pedestal. But he's trying to say, in the world of Christianity, how you need to care for orphans and widows, and don't get stained or develop the mind of the world where people who are rich should have preferential treatment, but we need to care for those in distress. And this is in direct contrast to like places in the Petrine epistles where it's more about sexual morality, and sometimes that way in Paul too. But yeah, so anyway, I just think, yeah, that kind of prepares us for what's coming on, going to be coming up in James.
Well, and just for me personally, the words in 22 through 27, it speaks to me of, don't just sit there and listen. Don't just sit there and be religious, but get up and go out and do.
Mm-hmm.
Be a Christian in the world. Care for others. Do the best you can for others. I like the fact of, it's like, don't just listen to it. Get up and go and do it. Carry it forward.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that message.
Yeah, that's something I've always liked about James as well. It's a more active sort of faith than I think we are presented with in some other writings in the New Testament.
And I think that's an important aspect of Judaism, that they didn't really make that distinction in Judaism, classical Judaism, that, performing mitzvahs and things like that, that was just an expression of their faith. It wasn't just intellectual for them. It wasn't believing the right thing for Jews. They argued, they discussed, they even argued with God, but the thing was, they were trying to live out what God wanted them to do, and perform acts of justice and mercy to those who were suffering. And yeah, go ahead. I see.
I've often heard that the main point that separates Christianity from both Judaism and Islam is that Christianity focuses on orthodoxy, so right belief, versus Judaism and Islam focus on orthopraxy, so
Right.
doing the proper things. That is a generalization, because both all three religions have care about both sides of that, but there's a preference for one versus the other.
I think in the way it's expressed today, contemporarily, I think the primitive church maybe had it a little more straight. That they became known, they became acceptable in the Roman world for the fact that they did practice their Christianity. But I think that division has come about as the church has aged, and the Western church split away and began to, and the Eastern church does too, but it became all about what you believed, or very much important. As you say, orthodoxy became so important, but that was not the primitive church. That was what do I call, a step backwards, I would say, from,
pretty early on in our history as a church. I would say if we're talking as early as the third and fourth century, when we've had these councils of the church where we get things like our creeds that we still say, because there was that was what they did at those councils. They decided we need a statement that says what we believe because that is very important to us, that everyone knows that we believe this and not whatever the heresy of the day was.
We're not disagreeing, Brian. I'm just saying at the very start, like
Sure.
in Acts and stuff like that, that's what I refer to as the primitive church. But you're right. That's exactly, but that happens frequently just in the establishment of a religion. When you begin to reform a religion, when you reformalize it, then you begin to look at those things as more important than sometimes those things that maintain the organization as distinct. And so it's a natural practice, but it's unfortunate because that dichotomy is definitely there.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the rest of what we'll read for today, which is through chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Could I ask someone to go ahead and read that portion?
I can read it.
Thank you, Leslie.
I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others? For example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you can stand over there or I'll sit on the floor, well, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? Listen to me, dear brothers and sisters. Hasn't God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith? Aren't they the ones who will inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you dishonor the poor. Isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who slander Jesus Christ, whose noble name you bear? Yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. You are guilty of breaking the law. For the person who keeps all of the law except one is as guilty as a person who has broken all of God's laws. For the same God who said, you must not commit adultery, also said, you must not murder. So if you murder somebody but do not commit adultery, you have still broken the law. So whatever you say or whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. But if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you.
Thank you, Leslie.
I like that last verse. If you have mercy, if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of my verses to live by right now.
It's a good one.
Well, you hear all these people arguing about the law and how we need to submit to the law, and if it's the law, we need to obey it, regardless of that God instituted government. But then I always like to just point to James 2:13. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Yeah.
I think so often people pick which rule they like to follow and then act holier than thou for it. But it says right there, thou shalt not commit adultery. Also, thou shalt not commit murder. It's not a pick and choose or choose your own adventure through life. These are the rules, all of them.
Mhm.
and you don't get to pick which ones you're choosing to follow.
But it also would have been, when this was written, it would have been radical to suggest that not treating rich people better than poor people would be on the same level as the Ten Commandments, because that was just kind of a fact of culture, is that the rich people were better than you.
Well,
Um,
I don't know if it was so much for me, but my parents, my grandparents, whatever. Church, the more you give, the closer to the front you sit. And I don't know if that was a Catholic thing or just a church thing, or particular to the churches they went to. But in a church, those seats were reserved for those who gave the most.
Well, that was true even in America, like in colonial times, right? The landowners had the boxed pews,
Right. I was thinking about that.
you
oh,
know.
it's even more recent than that. I have a friend who, as a child, his family was not permitted to rent any pew except the back pew in the church because of their uh, ethnic identity. I can't remember exactly where his family historically was from, but they were the wrong kind of white person in Nova Scotia uh, to be able to rent the pews near the front. Um, and so it's, I think, Jackie, you're spot on with what you're thinking with this, because when James is talking about meetings, he specifically means the worship that they were holding, is that there were people who were treating each other unequally in worship, and that for him was the biggest violation of this, is that even amongst the Christians they were doing this.
And I know the Episcopals still use the term renting a pew as far as being a member, which I wish long term they would change that in their bylaws or whatever. I think it's one of those things that's just in there, just hasn't been changed because it hasn't been changed. Um, but the term of renting a pew, and this particularly says people who are rich and people who are poor. But if we broaden that, people who are one way and people who are a different way. You know, our church particularly um is amazing with that. Um, I know, is at church the other day, a boy, I don't know, I know he's been there before. He has some, it would be called echolalia. He was repeating random things you said.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and nobody flinched, like, okay, well, whatever. And then I was up playing with somebody who was taught, okay, well, whatever. Um, but that's usually reserved for the back. You get to move over there because you're not like the rest of us. You know, you can come to church, but you don't get to fully participate. Um, whether you're different in that way, whether you're divorced, whether you're gay. So if we take that, this was big in that time, the money issue. Um, because if you had special needs, honestly, up until maybe the 70s, you were told just put your kid in an orphanage, you know, a group home and just pretend they died. So that wouldn't have even been a consideration.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're talking about just people who are different. They get to sit in the front. God is saying they get to sit wherever they want. And sometimes what's comfortable is the back, and that's fine. But we're not reserving the floor in the back. And like I said, this is particularly says money, but what makes you rich? Not just money. Be rich in a lot of ways. Can be entitled because you're typical, because you have the money, because you're of average.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that the author would agree with you that it's distinctions made, especially distinctions that are made the on the basis of things other than what you are doing for your community. I think he would argue against those in many different contexts. I mean, mercy triumphs over judgment.
There's a poem, I'm pretty sure it's Emily Dickinson. I was actually looking for it and I wasn't able to find it, about the author saying, I'm not religious or whatever. I don't go to church. I feed my neighbor on Sunday. I mow the neighbor's lawn, stuff like that. But I don't have religion and God in my life. But it shows all this stuff like, but I don't go to church on Sunday. Going to church on Sunday doesn't make you this great person. It's following all those commandments, all of them, not picking and choosing.
Now, if we're getting pedantic about it, going to church on Sundays is one of those commandments.
Oh, no, it definitely is. No, it absolutely is. But you don't get to only do that one.
No, and then go home and go live your life as how you want. But
I don't disagree with you, Jackie, that, if you're going to live by the law, you need to live by the entire law. But I would say that we're living under a new law that supersedes that just even doing all the right things is not enough. It's loving God with your whole self and loving others as yourselves. You can keep all the rules, you can be a Pharisee, but that doesn't make you a Christian. And and sometimes people that sometimes slip over one or two of the laws, like Jesus or his disciples, they were still following Jesus. And so we have to be, because the reason I'm saying this is that the tradition I came from was all about doing the right things and not doing the wrong things. That's what it meant to be a Christian. They didn't say that technically, but that was functionally the way it was. So I'm just sensitive to that, the fact that the rules are there as the laws are there as guidelines.
Mhm.
But the letter kills, the spirit brings life, and the letter kills. And so I'm just saying that, and I think James would agree with that too, is the fact that he's trying to say that you can't use the law. It's more than that. You actually have to act it out and live a life that's consistent, with what Jesus taught. So, but
I appreciate what you say, David, because I think I think that's I appreciate that description of the kind of church that you came from. I think churches that tend to be more progressive can also have our own issues with that, where if we are not careful, we can become a social service organization where we're just we're the neighborhood do-gooders if we don't focus that doing good on Christ.
we can do a lot of things for the wrong reasons and do them in the wrong ways. And so, yes, and I think it's important to make that distinction, that it's not one side or the other. Yeah.
And there's that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Mm-hmm. There is.
That is true. I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Well, any final thoughts before we end today about anything we've read, about what we've read last week or this week, James in general? Thoughts before?
This is just a thought that keeps running through my mind.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are so faithful about belonging to a church, attending church, and then they leave the church and they racially discriminate and they think nothing of it. And so it's like they're doing that one part of the law, but they're not showing mercy for the rest of it. And that I think that bothers me a lot.
Absolutely.
I agree with you. I only wish I could say that I didn't do anything like that, but
Everybody discriminates a little bit,
I don't mean, yeah, I mean generally not
or loses their temper occasionally, but you just have to keep trying.
Yeah, not to sound too Methodist, but we are always striving for holiness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a journey, not a.
All right, I'm gonna stop our recording.